Welcome to Countering Misinformation in Utah Classrooms. Before we proceed and introduce ourselves, I want to give you a chance to read the comic that we have up here for you to see.
It's always important to have a little levity in a rather important and weighty topic.
And if you're like me, I have a love-hate relationship with Facebook. I'm still there, but sometimes wonder why. So I'm Naomi Watkins, and I'm the Secondary English Language Arts and Library Media Specialist at the Utah State Board of Education.
And I'm Robert Austin. I'm the Humanities Team Coordinator at the Utah State Board of Ed and also coordinate secondary social studies as part of that work.
So to get started, we're going to ask you to look at these 4 pictures, and as you do, think about how you feel about teaching students how to counter misinformation. So I'm going to pause for a second to let you look at those images. And hopefully you have a letter in mind. You might even have 2. And as you can see, I'm a hiker, so this is why I picked these pictures. But sometimes teaching students how to do this could feel a lot like a muddy slog, like in C. Or maybe you feel like, yeah, it's hard work. I'm huffing and puffing up the hill, but I have the tools in my little briefcase that I need, and I feel like I can get there, even though it might be hard work. Or B, maybe you're just like, yeah, I've been really successful at it, and I'm feeling good, and I have this view from the top. I can congratulate myself for the hard work that I've done. Or maybe it's D, like you feel like, I don't know, like it's time to take a rest. Hopefully not D, but we're going to come back to this.
And I think the nice thing about pictures, and one of the reasons why I think you chose these, Naomi, was because it's your own interpretation that you get to make regarding what these pictures mean to you and signify to you.
Yeah, when we do this presentation live, we've heard a lot of different interpretations of the images, and I've actually gained a lot of insight from hearing people's thoughts. So a great activity, again, to use with your students, too. So during this little session that we're doing with you, we have a couple learning outcomes. We first hope that you are aware of the essential need for this work for setting the stage and cultivating a classroom community, that you will be aware of the motivations for misinformation and have tips for how to spot it. And most importantly, we hope that you feel more confident about teaching students strategies for how to counter misinformation. And we have a large bank of resources to share with you, and we hope that you'll utilize them in your classroom. And the way that we'll know that you've achieved those learning outcomes is if you'll be able to explain one challenge with teaching students how to counter misinformation, and one way that you'll work to mitigate this challenge. And then also committing to trying at least one of the activities or strategies that we talk about in our session today. And you'll try those with your students.
You know, when I was growing up, and you can't see me, so you don't know how old I am, but I'm old enough to remember when there were basically about 5 channels on television in a big console, and I would walk across the shag carpeting and change the channel. Well, those days are gone. The days of Walter Cronkite staring out from your screen and saying, well, that's the way it was, are no more. We have so many hundreds of possible resources, channels, links, social media links. So it's a brave new world. And part of the thing for us to consider is that the technology involved with media has really outpaced our own ability to figure out how to manage it and how to work with it. And so that's a real significant shift, even in these last 30 years.
I don't even know what some of these are on
I
here.
know, right?
Yeah.
So I want you to think about some data that we've seen nationally regarding this idea of fake news. It's fake news we use as shorthand for misinformation in this slide, but even that term has certainly been politicized. So we really want you to just kind of think about it as talking about misinformation. So if you think about how confident you are in your ability to spot fake news, do you think fake news causes a great deal of confusion? And if you're honest with yourself, have you ever knowingly shared fake news? Well, we're going to let you know what the national survey shows on the next slide. Fake news statistics, vast majority of people really are not very confident in their ability to recognize fake news. Only 26% are confident in recognizing fake news. I'm not going to read the rest of the slides. You're eminently capable of reading the data, but I do think it's important, that last piece, to know that 10% of Americans have knowingly shared fake news. So there's some bad actors out there amongst us. And it's important to kind of think about those motivations for why someone might knowingly share misinformation. What I want you to think about with this quote on the right-hand side of the screen is this idea about the kind of locus of responsibility. When we think about the responsibilities we all have to be civic and to be civically engaged and to be a part of this incredible experiment called the American Republic, we have a real obligation to learn the skills that used to be handed over to the fact checkers at journalism. It used to be that Walter Cronkite could tell us that that's the way it was, and we would believe it for the most part. What we've now seen is, in the last kind of bold quote here, the responsibility to restrict the spread of false content will fall mostly to the consumer. That as consumers of the media, we are now the ones who are responsible for countering that misinformation and making sense of it, checking out our sources.
So early, at the very beginning of this presentation, I asked you how you feel about teaching students. I didn't ask you to rate your skill level or your knowledge. I asked you about your feelings. And a big reason for that is because feelings play such a big part in misinformation, in what people share unknowingly, what people create. And it also, feelings also influence the people who are creating it. They know that they want to weigh on our emotions, and that things that are more emotionally charged are things that we are less likely to fact check. But most importantly, we as educators have to create environments where students feel comfortable talking about different ideas, where they are fine being wrong, and that we are fine being wrong sometimes too. Do you want to share that example of?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One of the things that I know is that I tell people that this idea about being able to really get clear about your feelings, we have to remember that our students come from families where conversations may be robust and safe and fun and engaging. There may be other patterns of behavior where people just yell at each other when they disagree on a topic. And whatever those feelings are for the kind of patterns of conversation around hard topics, they're going to bring those feelings and emotions into the classroom. And I have a great colleague, a friend of mine from Alpine School District, who she uses a visual of kind of think about your two hands held together tight and up against your chest, and that's where we very tightly hold our hands together close there, as if that's an issue that we really feel strongly about. And what we want to do in our classrooms is create an opportunity where students can actually feel like they can push those two hands forward and out and away from themselves far enough that they can look at that issue and look around the issue and think about the issue and not feel incredibly threatened by the actual act of looking deeply at a topic.
So this work of combating misinformation in the classroom starts from day one in educators creating a safe and reflective classroom community. Like Robert was just saying, students bring their lived experiences to the classroom. They may have even had negative experiences in classrooms prior trying to share ideas where a teacher has unfortunately shut them down. They'll also bring their positive experiences too. And when our experiences differ from those of our students, which happens a lot, it's really critical for us to exercise sensitivity, right, and openness and humility towards what our students bring to the classroom. So really making sure we have an asset-based view of our students, that we don't see their views and their backgrounds as being deficits, and really being committed to avoiding and challenging the stereotypes and biases that we all hold about different community groups. And I really like this last one about having a sense of cultural humility, that various cultures and backgrounds all have assets, they're all assets, right? That they bring different resources and viewpoints to the table, and that is a critical component to public education. So part of that too is developing classroom norms where students feel that they have a voice, not just in sharing their opinions, but also in developing those classroom norms. So an exercise that I really like is having students, along with you, imagining a classroom space that is educational, productive, and comfortable for learning, and focusing on what it feels like and what it sounds like. I mean, so often we're worried about the rules, right? You're going to be respectful, you're going to be on time, things like that. But like, what does that actually feel like? And what does that sound like? What does it sound like to be respectful? What does it sound like to disagree with someone in a way that's not putting them down? And so then you would create the norms that are needed to create the vision that your students have imagined. And part of that should be establishing a community of fact checkers. So, you know, tone is obviously really important with some of these questions, but if they're a norm, it's not seen as an attack. You know, it's one thing to go on Facebook and like say to your Aunt Martha, like, what are your sources of this article that you shared? This is from some stupid news site. You know, like the way that we talk online often is definitely not the way that we would want to model to our students. But if it's a norm in your classroom to be like, hey Robert, like, what are your sources? Where did you get that? Like, how do you know that that's true? Or how do you explain to me the process of where you found that? Then it's not seen as an attack, it's just seen as a norm, and this is how we as a community, as a classroom community, we value where we get our information.
Well, and I love what you said here about establishing a community of fact checkers, in that the locus of responsibility also shifts from the teacher as the arbiter of all information to a community of classmates who can all make that norm of being fact checkers.
Yeah, and so not only like, what are your sources? How do you know? Why do you think this? Blank. But I also think the last one's really important. So the example I've been using is I used to think that Brussels sprouts were disgusting, but now I sometimes think they're disgusting. I actually like Brussels sprouts way more than I dislike them. But modeling for our students that it's okay to change our minds about our opinions, about things that we think about. This is kind of a silly example, but starting even with this silly example is important. Just modeling these small things, like, I used to hate winter. Oh wait, I still do.
But the point there, and I love the Brussels sprouts example, honestly, because it is a kind of a safe, low risk or no risk conversation to start with Brussels sprouts and then move on to other topics. Because nobody's going to get really emotionally distressed at you unless they're a Brussels sprout producer out there somewhere.
Right.
They're not going to get that mad at you about the fact that you used to think this and now I think that. And to model the idea that all of learning is about change, and that we used to think this about COVID and now we think that about COVID, because the information changes and we get new information. And whether you're in a history classroom or a science classroom or a language arts classroom, even reading a novel, you may change your judgment about a character based on new information. And so that modeling of learning and changing your opinion based on evidence, it's a beautiful thing.
I think it's a sign of high emotional intelligence, actually.
So part of what we really know is a critical component of the work that we do when we're trying to counter misinformation, and we want to actively engage in this work, even though it might be, as you remember from your feelings, it might be a slog up a hill, a muddy muck, is to mitigate some of that. First is to be transparent. So I kind of joke about the fact that the word parent is in that word transparency, but if it's a mnemonic to use, then go for it. You want to be as transparent as possible with families. You want to be as transparent as possible with administrators about the topics you're going to teach. And of course, we know that you can't predict what might be discussed in a specific opportunity in the classroom. There are teachable moments when you have to engage in a topic because that's the topic of the day. But there are also lots of opportunities for you to say, you know what, that's a great topic for conversation. We're going to put that in the parking lot and we'll come back to that. But that will allow you the chance to be transparent with administrators or with families about some of the work you feel is important that you need to engage in. So use your disclosure statements. Get your content on Canvas or in other learning platforms. And remember that nature abhors a vacuum. Nature and the world really hates not having information. And so when you can provide the information, you're really kind of filling that vacuum, that void that's going to be filled with other people talking about what's going on in your classroom if you're not first talking about what's going on in your classroom. You need to also know that we've got a lot of support from the policy level on down at the legislative level, state board level regarding this kind of work. So, one of the first things to consider is that we have statutory language in state law that talks about the critical importance of the civic mission of schools. That civic education is a central function of public education. And this definition, I think, is a really fantastic working definition of civic education. The cultivation of informed, responsible participation in political life. If you think about that, and you think about creating competent citizens who can function in representative democracy, there's a whole lot of skills that those students need to be supported in. You also need to know that even within the most recent legislative session last year, House Concurrent Resolution 15 focused on the importance of civics education. And this resolution was passed by the Utah legislature. And it, among other things, said that whereas, because that's what resolutions do, they do lots of whereases, Utah students should be taught skills in constructive civil debate. I'm not going to read the rest of this. I think you can read it. But what I want you to really understand is that the legislature says this is important work. It's so important, we're going to pass a resolution saying so. The other thing to know is that obviously there's been a lot of conversation, and we wouldn't be having this webinar if we weren't talking about the challenges and conversations people are having around teaching about equity and the whole conversation on critical race theory. And in this case, R277-328, which is the board rule that was created to respond to some of these concerns, is available. And R277-328 really lays out a fundamental concept, and I've bolded that fundamental concept in that rule that talks about the marketplace of ideas. We live in an amazing country, honestly, and public education allows us the opportunity to engage with students in the free marketplace of ideas. Of course, transparency is critical. Of course, looking at bias, which we're going to talk about in a moment, is important. Making sure that the work we do is developmentally appropriate and tied to academic standards, and that we vet our materials before we teach them to our students. But you also understand that these policies in place reinforce the important role of countering misinformation. It's also important to know that across the state, studies have shown us that the vast majority of the general public, the population, believes that this is the function of public education. So the Sutherland Institute, political think tank, did a survey on civics education in Utah, and their data that they reported on came from over 600 survey participants randomly surveyed, and one of their big findings was, on our next slide, the top priority for civics education. That civics education needs to include helping students sift through information and decide for themselves what to believe. Absolutely, deciding for themselves what to believe. It also laid out concepts that are important for these survey respondents. And what you can see is that if the bar graph stretches, the farther it stretches to the right, the more aligned that statement is with the values of the people taking the survey. So in this case, looking at things like a transparency of curriculum and consistent standards, but also complete history, teaching differing viewpoints, teaching a comprehensive history and civics. These are all highly valued by the folks who took that survey in Utah. And again, another kind of support for you as you engage in this work to know that you're not alone. When we talk about and work with people live, when we're not doing this webinar just virtually, people can see that there are whole classrooms, whole auditoriums of other teachers who are committed to this work and who realize that they're not alone in this work.
So one of the first ways, so thanks Robert for all that supportive information.
You're welcome.
One of the first ways to teach students about how to counter misinformation is knowing what the different types are. So I'm going to talk about 5 different types, and you can, there's more out there, but these are the main 5. So satire is probably one that you are very familiar with, and if you are an English teacher, you teach about satire. Definitely been around for probably since the beginning of time, where humor or exaggeration is used to critique or to mock a person or an event or a policy or an organization. But if you don't know, for example, that The Onion is a satirical site, you might consider this headline might be true. But, and there's a lot of different satirical sites out there. The Onion tends to lean more left. There's right-leaning satirical sites too. But the dangerous part, it's not that satire itself is dangerous. It's when information or images or videos are taken from a satirical site and the context for that is removed. So like, let's say that someone took this piece about NASA and removed that it came from The Onion and just started sharing it all on its own without the source. Someone seeing it later wouldn't necessarily know that it was satire because they don't have the context of where it came from. And that's where the satire can become a dangerous piece of information. False context is when an image, a quote, or other piece of content is put into a different context. So like I was just talking about with The Onion, when they remove that it's from The Onion, it's now become false context. But here's another example. This is from a news site called the Seattle Tribune, which is actually not even real, but you can see that the masthead looks very official, it looks like it could be a real newspaper. And the headline here is about an Idaho mother who was sentenced to prison after she was cited for breastfeeding in public. So I actually saw this news article shared around social media, particularly by different mom groups, depending on their feelings about breastfeeding in public. But this actually never happened. There was never a woman who was sentenced to prison for breastfeeding in public. This is a random woman's mugshot from somewhere, and again, some mysterious woman who's breastfeeding.
But it looks legit. It's got the masthead.
I know. It looks very fancy. It's not in Comic Sans, so it must be true. And then imposter context. You see this more and more. There's a lot of different apps that allow you to create tweets or other types of social media posts posing as someone else or as a company or organization. In this case, this reporter had her entire article lifted and plagiarized from the Miami Herald into this Driscoll register. And actually, do you see the font there? It does look kind of silly. Mm-hmm. And it's been floating around. It was floating around Facebook, and they had it as it was written by somebody else completely. So it was totally plagiarized, but passed off as being somebody else's. And so you have news sites stealing, or fake news sites stealing content and posing as legitimate journalists quite often. Manipulated content, again, is also very prolific, where images are doctored from the original material in order to deceive, or the video is doctored. So in this case, the original is on the right, and the doctored photo with all the American flags is the one that's fake. And you see this happen, even just for humor, where people make memes or GIFs, changing like what the whiteboard is that someone's holding, or if there's a newspaper, they'll change that someone's holding a newspaper, they'll change that text to align with whatever they want.
Or there's that picture of Lincoln talking about the internet.
Yes, Lincoln being quoted from the internet for sure. Okay. And then there's just fabricated content. And again, you can see that there's multiple types of misinformation across a lot of these examples already. In fabricated content, it's entirely made up and it's designed to deceive you into thinking that it's real. So this one really is mind-blowing to the scale that these people went. So this group created an entirely fake physical edition of the Washington Post, claiming that then President Trump had resigned. So you can see the fake edition on the right, and it looks just like the Washington Post, if you're familiar with that. And then you can see that day's edition of the Washington Post there on the left. They made 10,000 physical copies of this fake edition and put it out on newsstands. I mean, this is like high-scale prank, right?
It takes pranking to a next level.
Yeah, and I mean, also that kind of scale of prank, if you want to say that, I think it was much more than, it's a higher level prank.
Right.
Takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of money and time to create actual physical newspapers. It does remind me of when there was an underground newspaper at my high school, and we all were like, who do you think who's behind it? Like, and people would guess and all of that, and it was more satire than anything.
And now we wonder if students even know what a newspaper is. We hope they do. We hope
yes,
they do.
We do.
But it's certainly a change.
But this speaks to like the reason why people are creating misinformation is because it's fueled by money. They get more clicks. They can influence the way people vote, the way that people spend their money. They can also, some people even just like to see, like, what if I put that out there and what will happen in the world to like create chaos? Like, that's part of the thrill for them. But definitely money and power are, prime motivators for why people create misinformation. So we want to teach kids about the different types, and part of that is by having them question the things that they are looking at and consuming. And these are probably not new to you. The two bottom questions, I think, are when we as educators play the biggest role, because when we are looking at what details might be omitted, that requires a great deal of background knowledge that our students might not have. And if you are a social studies teacher, this is a question that you deal with all the time, like who's missing from this image, who's not being talked about in this account of history. So, helping kids understand what might not be there that you would expect to be there. And then the next piece about where can they go to locate more accurate information. And since money is a big driver of misinformation, unfortunately, a lot of the news sites that spend a lot of time fact checking and writing credible news, that takes money and that takes time, and it's often behind paywalls, which then creates an access issue. So a lot of misinformation is free, and so that's why it's more easily consumable. People can see it more. They go to it because they don't necessarily either have the means to pay for the news, or they don't want to spend their money in that way.
Right.
But as educators, we have access to databases, to Gale research, and we can funnel students to places where they can find more accurate and credible information.
Well, and what I love, Naomi, is when you were talking about how there's so many sources of information that are free. We should use those like air quotes around free, because you're the product in that case. You're the consumer, but you're also the product. And I think that is really important for kids to understand about motivation and intention. And that we do have real free resources, incredible resources that are available for helping students sort and sift. We do want to really also clarify and kind of talk a little bit about the idea of misinformation versus disinformation, and that misinformation sometimes it's not intentionally spread. It's just bad information that's out there. But there are also a lot of bad actors who are intentionally spreading disinformation. A lot of governmental actors that are spreading disinformation. And again, going back to that motivation piece, a lot of folks who are making a lot of money off of sowing the kind of misinformation and disinformation around this planet that really forces us all to kind of take a step back and figure out proactive ways to respond.
So you may or may not have seen this website before. It's a fun little ditty. Getbadnews.com, which is a game. And it puts you in the driver's seat of being the bad guy or bad gal, where you are creating the misinformation. Your goal of the game is to gain as many followers as you possibly can in as quick amount of time doing different tactics. So it gives you or your students an inside view into the tactics that people use who are trying to make their misinformation go viral. I think I got like 100,000 followers in 10 minutes. So you can see if you can beat that.
I mean, you could probably pause this for a minute, open up another tab, see if you can beat it.
And you probably can beat me.
Come back and finish the webinar, please.
It also gives you in the game to spot either the real or the fake headline, which I found actually to be really difficult to navigate. I was not necessarily so great at figuring out which was real and what was not.
We think it's really critical to talk about bias and to think about bias and helping students understand where bias fits into misinformation. We all have biases. All humans have biases. We're all going to be biased. We might be biased against Brussels sprouts. We might be biased against or for the Los Angeles Dodgers. We might be biased against all sorts of things. But we need to help students understand that we all have biases. We need to practice reining those in, being clear and honest and open with our students about the challenge that we have regarding biases. And you can do that, again, you don't have to talk necessarily about partisan political biases. You can start first with merely life experiences regarding biases.
So recently I went to a new optometrist and I was, waiting for the optometrist to come in the room. And when the optometrist opened the door, I let out a little gasp.
So you have to kind of picture in your head, an optometrist from Central Casting. We brought in the optometrist, there they are, and then...
Well, and Robert, who do you think I expected the optometrist to be or to look like or whatever?
Well, unfortunately, because my bias is kind of similar to probably a lot of people, I picture an older guy in a white lab coat, probably wearing glasses.
Yeah.
White guy, too.
Yeah. Well, in walks a younger woman, white woman, and I was like, oh, because that's not who I expected to walk in the room, and I was a little appalled by what I had expected, because I think that women can be doctors. Like, that's a value that I hold, and so I was really surprised to see that bias creep up, that I had been holding it. It's also very strange, Robert, when your doctor becomes young, if your doctors are younger than you.
They're all younger than me now, right?
Yeah, it's a weird threshold to break.
But again, it gets back to us checking our biases. It also really opens the conversation for students to kind of help them at this moment when they're learning so much about the world to really understand what biases they have and to be open to some critical analysis and thinking. We have a lot of what's called confirmation bias, and this is where the algorithms and the real social engineering that is occurring, especially in social media, has found its foothold. There's nothing like hearing what you want to believe. There's nothing like someone validating everything that you have in your own lived experience. And that confirmation bias means that we continually move into more entrenched echo chambers where we have all of our beliefs confirmed and we don't question them. And I think one of the beauties of the classroom is we have an opportunity in our public education classrooms to help students understand and learn how to have a more balanced diet of information. There are really great resources available that show the biases that different sources of information kind of rest upon, and how, just like the food pyramid, you can choose and start to navigate your information diet with a wider range of information so that you break down some of that confirmation bias. There are also really important understandings when you're talking about misinformation and countering misinformation, to be able to think about topics that are open and open for deliberation versus topics that are closed. And trying to counter that misinformation and trying to help students understand that there are some topics that are closed, it doesn't not mean that everything is off limits. What we're talking about is that there are some topics where you are trying to have students deliberate and think about and come to their own conclusions based on evidence. There are other topics that are closed. Prime example would be enslavement. Slavery is not a topic that's open for conversation around its moral values. I mean, there's just no way to justify the enslavement of other human beings. The conversation then veers towards other areas of discussion and deliberation regarding the after effects of slavery, for example, in this country, and the legitimate and open topics regarding how you respond to that long history of slavery in this country. But you don't, it's a closed topic in terms of the relative morality of slavery. Another example here in this slide is to think about how some topics used to be open and now are closed. And a good example is in this picture, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Certainly at one point in American history, a very robust and open topic. It moved to a closed topic. And in the 1980s, with the Supreme Court decision and the Reagan administration's work to provide reparations to survivors' families from the internment of the Japanese Americans, you can see how that has shifted over time from an open topic to a closed topic. This is not something that is an arbitrary or like abstract conversation. I mean, these issues arise on a regular basis, especially because when we have an environment where people feel like they have to support all sides in a topic, at the expense of kind of legitimate evidence or at the expense of kind of taking a position on when a topic is closed, it can become a real problem. So here we have the case of a Florida man, in this case a school principal in Florida, who in responding to concerns that parents had regarding conversations about the Holocaust and wanting to kind of placate and understand that students come with different stories about events in history to the classroom. In this case, this principal says, I can't say the Holocaust is a factual historical event because I'm not in a position to do so as a school district employee. In this case, the kind of moral stance was lost. The obligation that we have as educators to take a position at some times when all the evidence is in your favor and you need to articulate why, for example, it makes no sense for people to argue that we didn't go to the moon. or that the Holocaust didn't occur, it rises to a level for us as educators to take a position. And that's part of the beauty of this work, is helping students understand evidence and where that comes from, and the kind of incredibly deep body of evidence that is at the heart of things like the Holocaust.
Well, and Mr. Latson was fired, by the way, so that there was that consequence as well. But I think this also speaks to having that community of fact checkers in your classroom. So if kids come with closed topic ideas that their families may believe, it can be like, well, how do you know? Why do you think that the Earth is flat?
Right.
Right. But then also realizing that there can be a great deal of cognitive dissonance if a kid does start looking at more credible sources and realizing, like, what my family might be saying may not be true. Like, that can create, going back to our conversation about feelings, like that is can be really what's the word I want? Straught.
Yeah, it's
fraught, not straught.
Yeah, and it's
straught.
But it's that's part of the whole concept of cognitive dissonance, is where learning is occurring. I mean, that's a pretty cool thing when you've got to kind of struggle and scaffold and work to some new learning. So part of, again, getting back, as Naomi was saying, about the idea of creating that community of fact checkers, is to get routines in your classroom where it becomes a scaffolded, normal exercise to think in academic terms, to think in sound, evidence-based strategies, and to do that work in a way that again shifts that responsibility to the students, and it normalizes that kind of deep thinking. So True for Who is one of the routines within Project Zero's work. That Project Zero's based in Harvard University, and the idea of being able to help students sort and sift information and really understand bias and sources and different perspectives is something that can be habit forming, and that's what we want with kids. We want them to develop these habits of mind.
So another great resource is presenting multiple sources that support a claim and having students look at these different sources, and including a variety of sources. So not just like, we often just think of, left and right leaning sources, but also local versus national. When there's a local event, I turn to local news before I go to national news. Because, there's different information presented there. Sometimes there's news stories that are not obviously in the national news. And then this big piece is waiting to come to a conclusion when the news is unfolding in real time. And that's really hard to do. So, my very, very first week teaching was the week that 9/11 happened. And talk about news unfolding in real time, right? And trying to, also trying to keep my own self in check and not jump to conclusions while I had a roomfuls of seventh graders with me. But we see this happening with the pandemic. We see this happening when, a crime story that's happening and they're searching for evidence or looking for clues and trying to figure out who did it. This happens all the time. And I think being able, again, to say to students, I got this new piece of information and that's made me change my mind about what I think happened or who's responsible.
There's so much misinformation, especially when there's a natural disaster, there's a hurricane or something, you'll see the dolphins swimming in the canal, and it's just a picture that's used time and time and time again.
So Civic Online Reasoning has this strategy called lateral reading, which we're going to have a short little video for you to watch about it. But if you're like me, the internet was not a part of my childhood and part of me growing up. And so I still, after watching this video, notice that I read websites scrolling from the top to the bottom. And lateral reading, which you're going to see, is about opening tabs and reading more laterally. So hopefully this will work. Short video about this, about 3 minutes.
We live in an era of information overabundance. This demands that we be more discerning and
So, I want to say before we move to this next part, the good news to me is that that group's research has shown that you can teach kids these skills and it works. And I think that is good news, right? Because sometimes it's like, it's overwhelming, but I think that's so great. And I learned something watching that video too. Like, oh, I probably shouldn't scroll.
Well, yeah, and I think what's cool about that video, and what's great about this is you teach kids those skills. It's almost like they have a new window into a new way to do things, kind of like a cheat code in gaming, where you have a skill set now, and they do get better. I mean, that's the data that shows from that survey and from that site shows that students get better at really understanding misinformation, which gets us to this point of being able to really kind of avoid the no-win rabbit hole of conspiracy theories. And we all know students who want to get you talking about something else so you won't do the quiz that day. But really, if you've created an opportunity where students are able to make the norm that fact-checking and sourcing and what are your sources and where's that evidence, and that becomes something that is a habit, a visible thinking routine that we've talked about, then you're going to be less likely to have to deal with this kind of no-win situation of a student who comes in saying, "Do you know the world is flat? We still think the world is flat. We're not sure." I do love the meme that from the folks out there who say that the Flat Earth Society has members around the globe. So
I don't think it was created by flat earthers.
I don't think it was created by flat earthers, but this I do hope that you feel like you've developed some skills here regarding these resources.
So my plug is to also partner with your library media specialist. They are a great resource, often underutilized, and they have their own library media standards that include information and research and media engagement. So precisely what we've been talking about today, and they can be your partner in this work along with your other content area colleagues. So please use your library media specialist. They often know about new cool databases or different digital tools that can be used, and they would love to be utilized. We also have the resources that we've included in our slide deck here at this bit.ly, plus many more. So you can pause here and write down that bit.ly to get the resources and these slides too. So revisiting what we had started out and set out to do, we're hoping that by now, after the end of this webinar, that you can explain a challenge that you have teaching students how to counter misinformation and how you can now mitigate that challenge. What will you do to make a difference for your students in teaching them how to overcome or to combat misinformation? And we would love for you to commit to trying at least one of the things that we talked about today. And we would also love to hear about that, how it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we hope you know that we feel like this work is incredibly important. It's probably some of the most important skills that you're going to teach students. It's some of the most important work that we're all engaging in right now across classrooms across this country. It's kind of a brave new world in terms of misinformation and how to counter it. So you're not alone, and you have the incredible skills to move ahead. So good luck out there in the classroom.
Yep, and thanks for all you do.